Okay, so we are going to cover both male and female reproductive system today. So we're going to start with the male reproductive system, and then we'll take a short break, and then we'll come back for the reproductive system of the female. This is a good review for your exam as well today. Okay, so when we're talking about the reproductive system in terms of male, we actually have what we call the primary sex organs, which are also called gonads. So I don't know if you ever heard of that word. So if you hear that, gonads are the same thing as basically sex organs. So in male, we have both primary and what we call accessory sex organs. So the primary sex organs would be the testes, that's the main one, as they are responsible for production of the sperm, or basically the sex cell. And the accessory gland, in case of male, there are three main ones, which are the prostate gland, bulbourethral gland, and the seminal vesicle. As we go through the PowerPoint, you'll learn more about these in terms of what they actually do in the body, in terms of contributing to either production of semen or in terms of protecting the sperm as it passes through the reproductive systems. And then you have the external genitalia. We'll talk about some of the erectile tissue and the anatomy of basically the sex organ, both male and female. So looking at the first part of the reproductive system, we're starting with the testes, which is kind of logical. So testes are basically, if you take a look at it, right here, if we open it up, you actually see a lot of coiled structure inside of that. And these coiled structures are referred to as the seminiferous tubules. So if you actually look at the seminiferous tubules under the microscope as a cross section, this is what they look like. So all of these little dots that you see basically are going to be your sperms that are under the stages of development. So the ones that you see farther on the edges, on the outer edges, basically, are going to be the ones that haven't produced yet. They haven't gone through the maturation step, basically. And then when you get to that center, when you have that basically hollow center, you can actually kind of see the tails of the sperms right here, which means these sperms are kind of ready and are eventually going to move forward to the next phase of their maturation. But again, if I ask you the specific location for a sperm production, then it would be the seminiferous tubules that are found inside the testes. So again, when you're looking at the testes, they are going to be responsible for the sperm production. What they're also going to do, they're also going to develop and maintain the secondary sex characteristics. So I want to just make a quick note for you guys here. When we're talking about secondary sex characteristics, what I mean by that is deeper voice in male, having body hair, having facial hair, having more muscle mass, producing more blood. All of these are characteristics of a typical male, and they're all associated with or identified as quote unquote secondary sex characteristics. The second part that you need to know is that these secondary sex characteristics are highly dependent on the amount of testosterone that are present inside the body. So basically, the more testosterone you have, the more visibly these secondary sex characteristics will be present. So in an alpha male, basically, these are going to be like super visible. Now, the other thing I want you guys to visualize in this organ is what we call a serous sac. So serous sac, we have heard of it multiple times already, right? We had it around the heart, we had it around our lungs, we had it within our digestive system, right? Like pericardium, peritoneum, and pleura, right? When we talk about different organs. So we have a serous sac, which is again that double membrane in terms of the testes as well. And in this case, they're called tunica vaginalis. So you can see, if you look at the name tunica vaginalis in here, you can see the double membrane as this yellow kind of cream color. So you have the outer layer and you have the inner layer. So that's your double membrane, which is the seroid sac, specifically called tunica vaginalis. Now, within the testes, so that's the tunica vaginalis, is the layer that is protecting the testes, basically. But what is the actual testes? So the actual testes has another protective shell, which is kind of that egg structure that you see, that kind of white color you see. It is a fibrous capsule called tunica albugina. I know it's kind of like, I give you a lot of names. But if you look inside the tunica albuginous, which is, albugina, which is these, basically kind of think about it as, you know, the foam that comes around the styrofoam that comes around your, you know, glassware or your TV that's protected. It's the same concept in our body. So tunica albugina basically going to encase and divide your testes to these little lobules, little segmentations like this. So this is like one segmentation, this is another one, this is another one. And these segmentations are called lobules, which basically means little lobes. And in each testis, there are about 250 to 300 of these little lobes. Now, what is inside of these protective shells? We mentioned it earlier, the seminiferous tubules. Again, this is the location where you actually produce the sperm. So within each of these lobes, lobules, I should say, you have between 1 to 4 coils of seminiferous tubules. So let's take this one. Let's take like this lobules. So notice in this lobule, for instance, you have 2 sets of coils that are visible for us. Again, as I mentioned earlier, what is the importance of the seminiferous tubules is that it produces a sperm, which just kind of makes sense. And then the other thing, which is I think is really fascinating, if you guys recall, we had talked about blood-brain barrier, which is basically one way of us protecting our brain from things that might be harmful in your bloodstream. So you had a barrier between your bloodstream and your brain tissue. So because testes are also super important in terms of basically creating the next generation, creating the offspring, it is important to protect it and make sure that things that might be harmful in your bloodstream doesn't get seeped into the testes and cause damage. So we actually have what we call blood testis barrier, which is created by your tunica albugina. So it is not only physically protecting the seminiferous tubules, but it's also protecting it against chemical damage that may come from your blood. Any questions so far, guys? Anything that's not clear? Good? Okay. So when we look at the testis tissue, so we're looking at the microscopic level, more specifically histology. What type of cells can we find inside the testes? So we will find 2 sets or 2 categories of cells. One of these cells are called interstitial cells of Leyding's, and the other cells are called Sertoli cells. It sounds very Italian to me. Sertoli, right? So interstitial cells of Leyding's are also called interstitial endocerinocytes. And where they're located, they're kind of tucked in between your seminiferous tubules. And I thought I had a picture of this, but let me go back to this. So these cells right here, these the tissues that you see right around them. So if this is your seminiferous tubules, the cells that are tucked in around them would be your interstitial cells of Leyding's. So what is the purpose of these? Like, so the most important job they do is to produce testosterone, which we have talked about many times already in this class. And again, the importance of it would be development of the secondary sex characteristics. It is important for development and maturation of the sex organs, etc. There is another set of cells called Sertoli cells. So Sertoli cells are like the babysitters of your reproductive system. And what they do is they are called either nursing cells or substenticular cells. And their job is to form that blood-testis barrier. Again, they're kind of making sure that what comes into contact with the testes are not going to cause damage to the testis. So they just basically kind of act as like, no, you cannot get in, yes, you can get in. So they are a barrier. The second thing they do is they support sperm development. So they're also important in terms of making sure that the person sexually matures and are able to produce a sperm at the correct number. No worries, Rosa. Now, the next thing I want to just briefly go over, I'm not going to get into detail about meiosis. You will review this in detail in terms of your physiology next semester, is what we call the process of producing either the sperm or the egg, and the process is called meiosis. You might have heard of it in association with mitosis. So let me just kind of quickly go over the difference between these. So when we hear the word mitosis, which I have mentioned it at the earlier part of the semester, we start with one cell. In our body, it would be 46 chromosomes inside of it that are 23 from the mom and 23 from the dad. And then by the end of mitosis, you are producing two cells, and these two cells are going to be identical to the original cell that you started with. Now, the most important job of mitosis is to basically making sure that you're replacing any damaged or dead cells, or just basically allow the person to grow. So like basically going from a child to an adult, that growth you see is a result of mitosis. Meiosis, on the other hand, here's a key point. You will start with one cell that has 46 chromosomes. So it's identical in terms of the structure and the number of chromosomes to what we start for mitosis. It goes through two stages of meiosis, which is called meiosis 1 and meiosis 2. And by end of meiosis 2, so when you're done with this whole process, you're going to end up with 4 cells. And each of these cells only going to have 23 chromosomes. So there is a significant difference between what we started, which was one cell, 46 chromosome, to 4 cells having only half of the chromosomes, which is kind of logical, because if you're making a sex cell, you only want to have half of the chromosomes in there, because it eventually gonna mix with the opposite sex cells, either be a sperm or egg, and the combination of those chromosomes needs to bring it back up to 46. So meiosis goal is to give you half of the genetic information from the mom, and then half of the genetic information from the dad. So when you combine them, you get a full genetic set. Is this making sense, guys, so far? Because meiosis gets a little bit complicated. So if there's any questions, please ask. I don't know what that means. Oh, does that mean yes? Hoping that means yes. I don't know. Okay. So meiosis is basically, again, cell divisions creating genetically varied cells with one set of DNA, which again makes sense. You only need one set either from the mom or from dad. And then each normal cell in your body contains 2 sets of the chromosome, maternal and paternal, which means one set from the mom, one set from the dad. Now, when we're developing a sperm, it's the process called a spermatogenesis. So basically a sperm genesis production of a sperm. These are processes that causes morphological change, which basically means the shape is changing as the sperm develop inside your seminiferous tubules, which is, again, kind of makes sense. That's the location where the sperm is growing. Now notice this, guys. The process of a spermatogenesis is about 64 days from the mature sperms to mature in a human. So it relatively takes a long time for the body to produce a sperm. However, do note that this is happening on everyday basis, which means that the sperm is being produced. So there's always some sperms that are being matured on a daily basis. And then eventually when this sperm gets released into the female reproductive system, it has the ability in average to survive about 3 days. Again, it doesn't mean that every sperm is surviving for 3 days, but in the I guess in the highest level, I guess I shouldn't say average, the highest level of survival is about 3 days, but many of them die even before that. Here's kind of showing you the whole idea of development of the sperm. So you start with basically kind of a regular, kind of a blob cell, and then as you move on, you can see the development of the sperm, which most important characteristic would be the development of the tail. Just a quick note that a lot of people say that, oh, you know what, why don't we, well, I'm not going to say you, but why don't the person gets pregnant even though if they have tried it? So one of the main reasons is maybe the low count of the sperm, which is kind of relatively the most common reason for it. And then another reason is if you look at the sperm, is their ability to swim. So the millions of the sperm that gets released into the female during the process of ejaculation, not all of these sperms are beautifully capable to do what they need to do. So a lot of these are basically, their tail is malfunctioning, so they won't swim the way they're supposed to, and therefore they cannot swim up through the female reproductive system. They kind of die off. Now let's say, okay, so the sperm has been produced. Let's move on to what is the next path for the sperm. So as the seminiferous tubules are finishing their job, they're passing the sperm to another duct set, which are kind of like merging the smaller ducts to a larger duct. So these little tubes that you see right here are called rete testes. And then as you go forward, the rete testes pass it to these tiny tubes, which are called efferent docule. So you go from seminiferous tubules to these orange tubes, which are rete testes, and then to these little branches right here called the efferent docules. Now, eventually you work to the next organ, which is the organ you see right here is this coma-shaped structure called the epididymis that sits right on top of the testes. And you can see that this is also coiled. So there is a lot of coiled inside the epididymis as well. Now I'm going to kind of show you what happens after that, and then we'll go from there. So as epididymis finishes its job with the sperm, then the sperm moves up through this tube right here called the vas deferens or ductus deferens. It goes through another tube called the ejaculatory duct, and then eventually goes through the 3 different parts of the urethra, which was mentioned during our urinary system last time. So we have the prostatic urethra, membranous urethra, penile or spongy urethra, and eventually out of the body. So in an exam, if I ask you guys write the path of a sperm through the reproductive system, I need you guys to list them in not only the testes and then epididymis and then urethra. You need to show me that even within the testes and going from testes to epididymis, you have different tubes that basically make that transition happen. So this is basically this is your slide that you want to take a look at when we are talking about the path of a sperm. Okay. Next, when we're talking about, as I said, in the reproductive path, we're going to the epididymis, which is this coma-shaped organ right on top of the testes. When it is uncoiled, which means all of these tiny coils that you see inside of it, when it's completely uncoiled, is about 6 meters, which is translate to what? 18 feet. If you're talking about feet-wise, I don't know how familiar you guys with meter. So it's about 18 feet, which is a pretty long tube. So the question is, why the heck do I want the sperm to take so long passing through the epididymis? Well, I should say it takes about 20 days to pass through the epididymis. The main reason is that the goal of epididymis is basically think about schooling your sperm. So it needs to teach it something. And what is it exactly teaching it? It's the ability to swim. So basically one of the most important functions, learn how to move your tail to be able to get to the female reproductive system. And then the second thing, when you are able to reach a mature oocyte, how to fertilize that oocyte, which means providing the right enzymes and the right tools to allow to break through the outer shell of oocyte and basically fertilize an egg. So there's two main things that happens. That's why it takes about 20 days for the epididymis journey to come to an end, basically, before it moves forward. Now, here's the thing. What if a man doesn't ejaculate during this time? During that time, the sperm gets stored in that space, and it can be stored up to 2 weeks in that space. However, if again, within that 2 weeks, the sperm is not utilized, then it just literally gets degraded. It gets broken down by the epididymis and gets recycled, which is, I think, is really good because it kind of shows that your body basically doesn't throw anything away. It recycles it and uses it for new sperm production. In terms of histology, for the epididymis, the type of cells that you have are pseudostratified columnar, which again, it looks like there are these long cells that are stacked on top of each other, but in reality, these cells are going to be single layers of long columnar cells, right, sitting right next to each other rather than on top of each other. Any question, any clarification so far, guys? By the way, I had 2 people logged in, but I can send only 1 person log in. So make sure you guys log in. Even if you're late, you still need to log in so I can give you your credit for being here. Okay. So let's move on to the next part, which is the tube that you see right here, starting from the epididymis, going up, doing this kind of round around the bladder, which is this little bulb you see right here, and then coming back down behind the bladder. So this tube is referred to as the vas deferens or ductus deferens. And again, it extending from the epididymis all the way to the accessory organ you see right here called the seminal vesicle. And again, it's looping around the bladder. Now, when it is coming out of the epididymis, so it's basically coming up from here, it's not only the vas deferens, it's not only the tube, you also have the bundling of the nerves, the arteries, and the veins that also supplying the testes as well. So if you look at the previous picture I showed you, you can see it in this picture. You can see the blue, yellow, and red that is depicting the nerves and the blood vessels. So if you combine all of this with your vas deferens or ductus deferens, so the tube and then all the blood vessels and nerves, that new structure is referred to as the spermatic cord. So if you look at this, it says meets with the spermatic blood vessels, and at that point is referred to as the spermatic cord. So when you're looking at your exam, pay attention. If I'm asking only for the tube, then the tube would be ductus or vas deferens. If I'm asking you what is the name of the fullest structure, including the blood vessels, then your answer would be spermatic cord. And then the job of the ductus deferens is simply taking the sperm and moving it up to continue the path to the rest of the reproductive system. So in terms of contribution, it's not really contributing anything other than transferring the sperm as a male is ready to ejaculate. And one quick note, if you look at the walls of the vas deferens, so the wall of the vas deferens is made up of a smooth muscle that basically kind of like your digestive system, it kind of squeezes and moves the sperm through this path. Any question, guys? Any clarification so far? No, we're good? Okay. So the next thing we have is and I think I have mentioned it here, so let me just talk about it. So as the vas deferens continues, here is the gland that we call the seminal vesicle. So seminal vesicle, we'll talk about it in just a minute as well. Seminal vesicle is one of the accessory glands that is contributing 60% of the volume of semen. So pay attention to the vocabulary I'm using. Up to this point, when we're talking about ductus deferens, all you have done is produce a sperm. But what a male ejaculates is called semen, which means that basically it's different from a sperm, or a sperm is part of the semen, I should say. So if you look at the volume, about 1 to 2 milliliter of the whole semen is actually a sperm. The rest of it is what we call fluid that gets released by your accessory gland. Most of that fluid, again, 60% of that fluid comes from the gland called seminal vesicle, which is this little tiny gland you see right behind it. So ductus deferens comes in and merges with the tube that comes from the seminal vesicle. And this tube that is created right here is called the ejaculatory duct. So this little kind of oblique tube that is coming, which is as a result of merging both your ductus deferens and the seminal vesicle together, is referred to as the ejaculatory duct. Now notice that the ejaculatory duct is passing through a circular organ right here. So this circular organ is called the prostate gland. We talked about it last time, if you guys remember, from urinary system. Prostate gland sits right underneath the bladder. So if here's your bladder, here's the prostate gland right underneath it or inferior to it. So ejaculatory duct passes through the prostate gland. That's a typical exam question as well for you guys. So make sure you guys take a look at that as well. So when it goes through the ejaculatory duct, now you are connecting that ejaculatory duct to your urethra. So here is the urethra, and then again, this urethra is going to go through the length of the penis and eventually release or ejaculate the semen into the external environment. So what are the three parts of the urethra? Again, if it's passing through the prostate, it's called the prostatic urethra, which is that initial phase that we see right here, this little tiny space. This area, look at this kind of meaty structure right here. This is where we call a urogenital diaphragm, basically separating the urinary bladder from the genitalia. So as it's passing through this membrane, we refer to that as membranous or intermediate urethra. And then lastly, when you get to the last part, which is basically passing through the length of the penis, is called either spongy or penile urethra. And again, it eventually exits through the tip of the penis. Here's a picture that kind of depicts that really well. So again, here's your prostatic urethra. Here is your membrane, so that's your membranous urethra. And then the length of the penis right here would be your spongy or penile urethra. Okay. So now we have looked at the path of the sperm and / semen through the reproductive system. So what is the accessory glands that basically make all of these possible? So we have mentioned them, the seminal vesicle, the prostate gland, and the bulbourethral gland. So first of all, focus on the location of each of these glands. So if I ask you, where is the location of the seminal vesicle glands? They're sitting posterior to bladder. So here is your bladder again, that circular blob, that's your bladder. right behind the bladder, which is right here. You can see the seminal vesicle. Again, if this is my bladder, the prostate gland sits right underneath it or inferior to that. And then the third gland, which is this tiny little pea-sized gland, sits underneath the prostate gland, which are these two little paired structure called the bulbourethral gland. In this picture, they're depicted as this little circle right here. So what is the job of each of these glands? So the seminal vesicle, as I mentioned, is producing about 60% of what we call semen volume. And the most important thing it does, it produces what we have called fructose. So probably you have heard of fructose. It's some sort of sugar, right? Kind of like dextrose or glucose. It's a sort of sugar. It is, more importantly, the main source of nutrients for the sperm as it swims its way through the reproductive system and eventually through the female reproductive system. So I want you guys to take a moment to think about it. When you look at a sperm, the sperm is relatively small, right? Because again, male releases so much of it, they can't put a lot of effort into producing it. So all you have is that head portion, which is where you keep your genetic information, those 23 chromosomes, and their very long tail that enables it to swim through the reproductive system. So the question is, if the sperm has to swim such a long distance to eventually reach a fertilized egg, where does this nutrients come from? And its nutrients actually comes from the area that surrounds it. So that's a really cool thing. So your body basically, or a male body, let's just say, male body produces the food and sends it with the sperm, which is, I think, is pretty awesome. There is a secondary function with the fluid that gets released, and it is the fluid that allows the fertilization to be enhanced. We don't get into that. That's something that we usually discuss in terms of physiology and how that changes happen. But basically, it helps to make sure that when the sperm reaches its destination, it has a higher chance of fertilizing an egg and also surviving in the female reproductive system. The second gland that we have mentioned is the prostate gland. So prostate gland is about the size of a chestnut. So it's a relatively small gland. It surrounds the urethra. Again, we talked about this, and that's why it becomes an issue for male as they age, because that prostate gland gets bigger and it squeezes the urethra. It is located right below the bladder. And when we look at the material it produces about 25 to 30% of what we consider semen. So it is producing a good amount of fluid that contributes to semen. Now, what is its job? So why do I need the prostate gland to help with that? So the most important job it does, it enhances the sperm motility. So basically, it ensures that the environment the sperm is swimming through is an ideal environment, is slick enough that the sperm can swim through it and again, have better access to the female reproductive system. So for your exam, please guys, take a few minutes to make sure you guys understand what portion of the semen each of these accessory glands contribute to, and then what do they actually do in terms of their function for the reproductive system. Okay, the third gland we have, again, it's a really small gland, it's about a pea size, so, but it does a lot of function, is a gland called bulbourethral. So bulbo implies like bulbous or a small circular structure. And then urethral is because it's sitting right next to the urethra. So if you look at these two tiny glands that kind of look like eyes, they actually have these little ducts that connects directly into the urethra. So this is really important for you guys to understand that the bulbourethra directly connects to the urethra urethra tube. So what does it do? So when you look at the concept of erection and ejaculation, so male usually releases small amount of fluid, and I'm going to put that in quote, called pre-cum, right before ejaculation. And that fluid literally comes from the bulbourethral gland, and it has a very important function. So think about the fact that in case of male, the urethra is used both for urinary system as well as reproductive system. So there is only one opening for both of them. Hence, a man cannot pee and ejaculate at the same time. Now, we have, I don't know if I mentioned that or not, but when we look at the pH or acidity of the urine pH is usually around 6, which is acidic. On the other hand, when you look at the environment the sperm is going to be happy at, it's an alkaline or basic environment. So right before a male ejaculates, bulbourethral gland is going to release a neutral solution that is basically going to wash away that acidity of the urine and create a nice environment in the urethra so the sperm can swim and survive within that environment. It also creates an environment that enhances the fertilization for pH, because again, it has that alkaline environment, which is more ideal for the sperm to survive and eventually fertilize an egg. Is this making sense so far, guys? Is there any question, clarification on anything? They're like, I don't want to ask some questions about sexual system. I don't know who Chrissy is. What was your question? So you type your question, I'll read it when we get to it, okay? So I know it's like one of the most awkward topics to ask questions for a lot of people. I don't know why, but I mean, I think it's the kind of a concept of taboo, but I'd rather you guys know about it than not know about it. That's my thing. And Google is not the best source guide, by the way. Anyways, so let's take a look at the external genitalia for male. So you can see a really good picture of the whole reproductive system in this one, including the external genitalia. Sorry, one second. So the seminal vesicle, I can go back to this slide so you can see it as well. So there's two functions. One is that it provides the nutrients that your sperm needs, because your sperm doesn't really have the ability itself to carry the nutrients inside of it. So the surrounding environment basically carries the food. It's kind of like you're in heaven and like you go outside and you pick a fruit from a tree. So your food is basically around you. And then the second thing is making sure that when the sperm reaches the egg, it has the ability to fertilize it. So it gives it tools that helps it, that enhance the fertilization. Hopefully that made sense. Oh, okay. Thank you, Nelson. No, it doesn't say that. It says Chrissy. You're Chrissy right now. It doesn't say Nelson. That's why I said, who is that? Moving on. I'm like, Nelson has become Chrissy today. I'm like, I see some new names on my thing, but I'm assuming if you guys are using somebody else's Zoom. So that's why. And that's why we log in. And you chat, in the chat box, you type your name. Okay, so let's move on to the external genitalia. So the external genitalia has two main erectile tissue, which basically forms the majority of the mass of the penis. These two erectile tissue, a kind of cross-section of it is shown here. There are these two large erectile tissue, and they have noticed that they have their own blood vessels right at the center and then also on the top. So these two are paired and they're called corpora cavernosa. If we talk about one of them, they're called corpus cavernosum with a UM at the end instead of an A at the end, kind of like a spongiosa. And then you have a smaller one on the anterior aspect of the penis, and this is referred to as the corpus spongiosum. So it's much smaller. It doesn't have its own blood vessel. However, its most important characteristic is that the urethra is passing right at its center. So that's the anterior aspect of the penis. And again, underneath those, you have those two larger body called the corpora cavernosa. Now, when you look at the tip of the penis, you have that kind of enlarged structure called the glans penis. And you have, when a male is born, we have the structure called prepuce, which is that kind of the foreskin that covers the glans penis. And when they do the process of circumcision, they actually remove that piece of skin from the that prepuce from the glans penis. And there's arguments for and against it, kind of research on this. And I always mention this because I think a lot of people have that question. Honestly, the research that is out there as of right now, I would say as of a year ago, it's kind of conflicted on the topic as far as is that a good idea to remove it or keep it. There are research that says it does lower the chance of infection. There's the research that says it increases the chance of infection in males. So it goes back to your personal belief and kind of religious belief, because a lot of times it has a religious connection for people to remove it or not to remove it. But as of right now, it's one of those topics that the research is kind of halfway in between, with no, I guess, conclusive result as of yet. So the next thing we have is a scrotum. A scrotum is basically the skin that surrounds the testes. So it's a protective, basically a skin. Really, really cool fact about the scrotum is that the muscles on the skin are relatively loose around the testes for the goal of keeping testes slightly below the body or away from the body. And the main reason is for the sperm to effectively develop, you need about 3 degrees Fahrenheit cooler environment compared to the regular body temperature. Sorry, I said Fahrenheit, centigrade. 3 degrees centigrade cooler body temperature. So if your regular body temperature is about 37 degrees, the sperm needs about 34 degrees for the proper environment. And a lot of times you kind of think about when a male has a low sperm count, one of the first things they tell him to do is to avoid hot tubs, taking hot bath, because again, that warms up the testes and lower the chance of a sperm development. The other thing they tell you is to stop wearing tight clothing and underwear. Because again, the tighter your clothing is, the closer the testes are going to be to the actual body temperature, which means the lower your sperm count is going to be. The other thing that I just want to quickly add, because I think a lot of people also note that, is smoking. Smoking also lowers the development of a sperm or a sperm count in male. Now, if you take a look at the picture, and I kind of showed you this picture because I like how they layered it to the multiple layer that you found around the testes. So you have the outermost layer, which is the scrotum basically. And you can see that the scrotum also has the kind of this fascia as part of it. But the more important thing is these kind of twisting and tangling muscles that you see around the testes. And these tangled muscles are referred to as the cremaster muscles. Sorry, my eye is like driving me crazy. Cryomaster muscles are basically the one that allows the sperm to be elevated when a male gets basically excited or get ready for ejaculations. So under normal conditions, these cryomaster muscles are relatively relaxed, which means that the testes are going to sit away from the body, and during ejaculation, the cryomaster muscle kind of tighten up and allows the testes to be elevated. Any questions, clarification on this? Okay. This picture you have, or a picture similar to this, would be something you guys want to make sure you guys are comfortable with for your lecture exam in terms of labeling. So make sure you guys take a look at this. And that's about it for the male reproductive system. Questions, clarification on anything? Clearly, Nelson, you're not yourself right now, so awesome. Okay. It kind of took me a little bit less than time that I expected. Is it okay if I continue with the female reproductive system, guys? Okay. So let's go ahead and start, and then that way I'll still give you a break soon. But again, reproductive system anatomy is not that complicated. When we talk about, pregnancy and getting into those whole concept of development of fetus and embryology, that's the lecture that's going to take a long time, but that's physiology, not anatomy. So, and just a thumbs up for that you can see my screen for the female reproductive system. Okay, thank you guys. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. So again, we used the word gonads before. So gonads simply meant that the either male or female reproductive system, depending on the gender. So in case of female, the main organ would be the ovaries. These are about kind of like almond shape, located in the pelvic cavity on the lateral aspect. And as I said, it's flanking the uterus. And I'll show you guys in the picture in just a minute how they're actually localized inside the pelvic. They are attached to the uterus as well as the wall of the pelvic region using 4 sets of ligaments, and I'll talk about those as well. Their job is basically, again, kind of looking at the male and female. Their job is to produce your gametes, which are basically your sex cells. In this case, a lot of time we just call them, I guess the common terminology is egg, but the proper terminology would be oocyte or ovum for a mature oocyte. So oocyte is basically what gets released during the process of ovulation from an ovary. It travels up through what we call the fallopian tube, where it gets fertilized by a sperm and eventually develops into an embryo, and eventually again move through the next phase, which is the fetus. We also have the main sex hormone in females, the main sex hormones in female, which is estrogen and progesterone. And both of these are extremely important for what we call the menstrual cycle in a woman, which is the whole development of the egg. It's extremely important during pregnancy. There is such an increase in the levels of estrogen and progesterone during pregnancy. And they also help with development of the secondary sex characteristics in female, such as a kind of more, I guess, sharper voice, thinner vocal cords. They help development of the mammary tissue or breast tissue, hair in the genitalia and armpits, and again, ability to start their cycle and continue their menstrual cycle from the moment of puberty all the way to menopause. Yeah, high-pitched voice. So as I mentioned, in terms of the ovaries, you really need to suspend it within the pelvic cavity because there is, again, nothing that's attached to, there's no point of attachment. So you actually have to kind of string the reproductive system of the female within the pelvic cavity. And your body does that by using 4 separate ligaments. Now, these separate ligaments are called suspensory ligaments, which is kind of the name, kind of self-explanatory. They're going to suspend the ovaries, ovarian ligament, which is going to go basically from the ovary to the uterus. What we call a round ligament, and I'll show you that in just a second, and what we call a broad ligament, which is kind of this sheath-like structure that extends through the reproductive system or female reproductive system. So let's take a look. So here is the reproductive system as a whole. You have those 2 almond-shaped structure right here, one right here, your ovaries. You have the tube that connects to the uterus. So these 2 tubes are called your fallopian tubes or uterine tubes. You have the muscular mass right here called the uterus. And then cervix is this kind of triangular structure you see right here. And then eventually opening up to the external environment using the muscular tube called vagina. The 4 ligaments include, again, the suspensory ligament you see right here. Again, it's suspending the reproductive organs. The ovarian ligament, which goes from the ovaries to the uterus. This kind of curtain-like structure you see right here, this kind of triangular, it's kind of covering, it's like a sheath. That's referred to as the broad ligament. And then another ligament passing through that to secure the uterus, that's called the round ligament. So in your exam, please make sure you guys can both identify these ligaments on a picture, or if I give you a name and ask you or a description of a location, then you should be able to identify these ligaments by name. Now, to start with, what we're going to look at is what is happening inside our ovary. So we're going to look at the anatomy of the ovary briefly, and then looking at what is taking place in what we call ovarian cycle, which is basically development and release of an egg during this process. So ovarian cycle itself has 3 phases, what we call the follicular phase, what we call ovulation, which is again the release of the egg from the ovary, and whatever is left over inside the ovary is associated with what we call the luteal phase. So ovarian cycle, like the uterine cycle, is about 28 days. That's not going to change. So within the cycle, you basically mature in average, one oocyte per cycle. So let's take a look at our first phase in the ovarian cycle called the follicular phase. Logically, I hope everybody knows that ovulation in a female takes place on the 14th day of the cycle. So again, halfway mark if the cycle is 28 days. And the follicular phase, what you actually start with, the original cells that are found inside the ovary are called primordial follicle. So these are basically the baby cells that are found inside your ovaries. They really have no specific or features. They are extremely small. And in average, by the time a female reaches puberty, you only have about 400,000 of them. And it seems like a large number, but do remember that male during every ejaculation release millions of sperms. But I'm talking about millions, I'm talking about 100 million sperms. So having 400,000 eggs or oocytes or primordial follicle, it's not really a high number. But again, primordial follicle is what you actually see. Sorry, I want to see if you actually depict it here. So they didn't depict it here. they're actually even smaller than this picture. So they are really tiny structures. I think I have another picture. Okay. So primordial follicles are these, oh, they show them here. Anyway, so they show them as these really tiny structures. And again, you can see there's no characteristics or features to them. And you can see how that changes as we go through the development of a single oocyte. So primordial follicle is what we actually start with. The other thing I want you guys to note about this is when we look at an oocyte, which is your egg. So here is your egg, but you have a layer of cells around that. And these cells are basically these cells around the oocyte, plus the oocyte as a whole is called a follicle. So see how the word follicle is being repeated here? Follicle, follicle, secondary follicle, and then Graafian follicle down here. So all of these are basically saying the cells that are around the oocyte plus the oocyte as a whole are referred to as follicle. So we start with what we call primordial follicle, which is again the most immature form of the follicle. Now, as these 14 days start to pass, you are starting your follicle to become a primary follicle. So you are starting to see the follicular or granulosa cells, the cells that are around the oocyte, are starting to develop. They're going to become larger. As you go from primary follicle to a secondary follicle, you're going to add more layers. So instead of having a single layer of follicular cells, you're going to add more layers to that. And you're also going to add what we call a cavity, and I'll show you guys in just a second. That cavity eventually develops to what we call an antrum. So secondary follicle eventually becomes what we call a mature or a Graafian follicle. So this is going to have many layers of the follicular cells, this beautiful oocyte, which is eventually going to be released during ovulation, and a cavity that is filled with fluid called an antrum. So let me just show you this picture. So here is basically what we're looking at. So here is your follicular cells, right? Multiple layer of follicular cells in a mature Graafian follicle. Right here, this circle is your oocyte, which is kind of a mature egg. This space you see right here is this cavity that's filled with a fluid called the antrum. And the last thing that you can see is if you look at your oocyte, there is another layer of cells around it. So this kind of pink layering that is not the same as your granulosa cells, but another layer of cells that are formed right around the oocyte. And these cells that surrounding the ovum, or basically your oocyte, are called corona radiata. So you can see that again, these sets that you see right here, these cells right around that called corona radiata. Now, one thing that I do want you guys to notice, as we go from the Graafian follicle to release of the egg, which is the process of ovulation, you see right here, here is the most important thing you want to notice. The granulosa cell that you guys had here, those cells remain inside the ovary. The corona radiata cells that were immediately around your oocyte actually gets released during the process of ovulation. So your oocyte is basically not alone. Your oocyte is taking the corona radiata with it. So this is really important because when we're looking at the fertilized egg, so a sperm actually when gets basically reach an oocyte, it doesn't reach the oocyte just by itself. It needs to what first goes through the corona radiata and then eventually reaches an egg. It actually also has to go through what we call zona pellucida. So think about this. When a sperm gets into, and it always fascinates me, when a sperm gets into the female reproductive system, it literally has to swim through the vagina, through the cervix, through the uterus, through the fallopian tube, and reach this area or this curvature, which is called the ampulla. So at that point, there is a hope, if you want to get C pregnancy, that there is an egg that has traveled up through the fallopian tube and it's going to meet the sperm here, okay? So a sperm has swum all of this way and it has found an egg now, but it's not done yet. Now it has to go through the corona radiata, it has to go through zona pellucida, and then eventually get access to the oocyte and fertilize it. And that's why the chance of pregnancy, even if you're releasing 100 million sperm, the chance of the fertilization of the egg is so low, is because it has to basically jump through so many hurdles to reach its destination. Can I answer any question for you guys? Is this making sense so far? Well, if you covered this in the 6th grade, that's a really good thing. So, so again, when I'm asking you guys a question, please make sure you guys kind of step by step write the steps of the follicular phase, which is again primordial follicle, primary follicle, secondary follicle, Graafian follicle. And that process going through these phases takes about 13 days. And by the 14th days in a regular female cycle, you have the process of ovulation, which is what is depicted here. So ovulation, as I said multiple times, is the release of your oocyte or your ovum with its corona radiata into the pelvic cavity. And I want to make sure this is clear, guys. If you look at this picture, the oocyte that's being released, or the ovum that's being released, it's not released directly into the fallopian tube. It actually gets released into the pelvic cavity, which is, I think, is fascinating. So the question is, wait, so if it's a pelvic cavity, how does it end inside the fallopian tube? And for that, we need what we call fimbris. So if you look at, I have to go forward. If you look at the ovaries right here, you see these finger-like extensions more visible here. So they're kind of hugging the ovary. So if this hand is ovary, this is my fimbris. Notice that they're not touching each other, guys. It's hugging it. There is still a gap between them. So what is happening as the body gets ready for ovulation, the hormonal changes that are happening triggers the movement of your fimbris. So these fimbris are going to create this kind of wave motion. So they're kind of doing this. So as the egg or oocyte gets released from the ovaries, it gets released into this space, right? So the finger-like with their motions, these fimbris with their motion kind of gently move the oocyte into the fallopian tube. But please, please make sure that you understand that there is no direct connection between the ovary and the uterine tube. That job of transfer of the egg into the fallopian tube is done by your fimbris. Okay, so again, this is basically what it says here on this slide. So what happens, again, if you kind of look back at this picture, we said that the follicular or granulosa cells that are remaining behind after the ovulation, you need to do something with them. So what they do actually, they become this really kind of pronounced structure you see right here called the corpus luteum. So which is basically a start of the luteal phase. So corpus luteum is extremely important because it's going to produce a significant amount of estrogen. So why do I need estrogen? Because as the estrogen level elevates, as well as progesterone, but not as much, as the level of these two hormones increase, then you are going to present the inside lining of the uterus for a possible pregnancy and implantation of the embryo. We'll talk about that in just a minute as well. So basically, when we're thinking about uterus, the inside lining of the uterus is where the baby going to develop basically and eventually form its placenta. So having the right amount of hormones like estrogen and progesterone is extremely important, and the corpus luteum is going to produce a significant amount of those hormones. But here's the thing. What if there is no pregnancy? What if the cycle ends, you're reaching the end of the cycle, there's no pregnancy happen, the egg already been destroyed? Then at that point, you basically start to degrade your corpus luteum, and it becomes a structure called corpus albicans. And it's literally stop producing the hormone, it shrivels up and becomes much smaller, and eventually completely gets degraded by the ovary. And again, you can see that in this picture as well. So here's your corpus luteum, and then here is the degraded version, which is called the corpus albicans. So if you look at this picture, guys, this picture shows you all of the phases that we described. Up here, we have the follicular phase. Right here, they described it as tertiary follicle, but what we call it is mature or graphene follicle. You have the process of ovulation and then the luteal phase down here. Okay. One other thing, sorry, I want to make sure that I cover this concept with you guys. The other aspect of the ovary that's just depicted on a picture for you guys here is separation of the, or identify, no, it doesn't go in a circle actually, but it's just easier for us to depict it this way. Just a quick note, that's actually a good question. In this picture, what you see is only one primordial follicle is starting to develop to the primary follicle and secondary oocyte. In reality, you actually go and take multiple primordial follicle and they start this process. They just only typically one of those primordial follicle complete and reaches the graphene follicle. So as a woman ages, basically, you're not doing, it's like, oh, let me just choose this primordial follicle for this cycle or this primordial follicle for this cycle. You actually, as the hormones increases and you have that elevation of the estrogen and progesterone on the first days of the cycle, there are multiple primordial follicles that start this process, but many of them are unsuccessful and you only have one reaching the graphene follicle. But if you ever had twins, right? Twins that are not identical or triplets that are not identical, what is happening is that multiple follicles have reached maturity, have released through the ovulation, and have been fertilized by the egg. If you're looking at identical twin, that is not true. We're talking about differences in terms of gender or physical characteristic that separate them as maternal twins rather than paternal twins. Are we clear? Does that make sense? Yeah, it's a common misunderstanding. Awesome. Okay. So when we're looking at the ovaries, my brain stopped. When we're looking at the ovaries, like your kidneys, remember the outer edge of the kidney was called cortex and the central part was called medulla. So same concept applies here. So if you look at it, the edges or the more outer aspect of the ovary is referred to as the cortex, and the more inner aspect where all of the blood vessels for the ovary actually come in, that's referred to as the medulla. And again, that's a feature that you see in both the kidneys as well as the ovaries. And in this picture, they don't show it, but you also have a protective fibrous capsule around the ovary as well, but they haven't labeled that. So. Okay, sorry, I want to see a time. Are you guys okay if I finish the PowerPoint and you guys just go from there? That way we have that break between. Okay. Okay, so let's go ahead and continue. So again, the journey of the egg so far has been that it was picked up by the femores and get pushed into the uterine tube. So first of all, let me make sure that you guys are clear on this. the length of the fallopian tube, that's basically going from here all the way to the uterus. Yes, please, of course. The length of the fallopian tube has these little finger-like extensions, which are your cilia. And what the cilia are doing is gently moving the egg or the oocyte through the path of the fallopian tube, and then eventually helping it reach the uterus. So when you're looking at the fallopian tube, there are multiple parts to that, or segmentation to it. You have the area immediately after the fimbriae called the infundibulum. We saw that for the brain as well. You have the curvature in the fallopian tube called the ampulla. And as I mentioned, ampulla is important because it's the location where the sperm can reach and fertilize an egg. And then at the end, when you're getting close to the uterus, so basically that transition from the fallopian tube into the uterus is called isthmus. So there's 3 parts into the uterus, so make sure you guys are also familiar with those. So again, uterine tube is the location where, uterine or fallopian tube is where the egg or oocyte gets fertilized. Kind of think about it, a sperm is swimming up and the little cilia are pushing the egg aside, and that's where they meet and fall in love, and the rest is history. Sorry, just kidding. And again, ampulla, really important. It's a location for fertilization, and we have already talked about fimbriae in terms of moving the egg into the fallopian tube. So moving forward, the uterus, which is the next part of the female reproductive system, most important characteristic of this is that it is mostly muscular. And the type of muscle you see in this organ is a smooth muscle. Now, if you look at the uterus in terms of layers, it has 3 separate. The innermost lining is called endometrium. So endometrium, which is the inner lining you see right here, basically right next to the empty cavity at the center, is the layer that basically gets shed during the menstrual cycle. So when a woman has her period, basically this endometrium, which is really highly vascularized layer, is what we're actually getting rid of. The second layer you see right here is relatively thick. It forms majority of the mass of the uterus. It's called myometrium. Hopefully you guys remember the word myo means muscle. So myometrium implies the layer or the muscular layer of the uterus. Quick note on that. Myometrium is going to be the one that's sensitive to oxytocin. So oxytocin, hopefully all of you guys have heard of it sometime in your life, is the hormone that is called the love hormone. It's the one that creates connections between people. It's the one that surges when somebody falls in love. And typically it's at higher level when a woman is close to birth or breastfeeding, because it also causes the release of milk from the mammary tissue. So, sorry. No, they weren't butterflies. So, no, they're not. Stop putting a negative spin on it, please. So oxytocin is also the one hormone that women receive if you are getting an induced birth. So if you're being induced to basically give birth, what they actually give you is the synthetic version of the oxytocin hormone that basically force the body to start contracting the uterus and basically pushing the baby out through the birth canal, which I think is kind of cool. Perimetrium, which is the outer lining, so the outermost lining is basically connective tissue and epithelium tissue called the perimetrium or adventitia, which should sound familiar to you as well. So again, when you're looking at this, please pay attention. Am I asking you for the organ, or am I asking you for the layers within the uterus? So if it's the layers, it's endo, myo, or perimetrium, versus the organ as a whole is called the uterus. The other thing that I think is kind of cool, and I'm going to tell you a funny story because it always makes me laugh when I think about the word. It's the dome-shaped top portion of the uterus is called the fundus. So fundus of uterus is basically opening the space more for the uterus to expand. So I'm going to tell you this story and then we'll move on. So I had a student, I was going over this a while ago, and I had a student that was an EMT. So his question was, when I was teaching the digestive system, anybody remember we have heard of the word fundus in digestive system? Where did we hear it? In association with what? The stomach, correct. So one of my students, when I was doing the digestive system lecture, it says, oh, you know, when we were going through our EMT training, they said that if you have a woman in your ambulance that has given birth, what you want to do is push on the fundus, right? Because what you do when you push on the fundus, basically kind of like this movement of pushing out, is it helps remove the placenta and it basically push all of the blood vessels and other stuff that's associated with the pregnancy out of the uterus. So you want basically clean the uterus. And he was telling me he was confused. Why should I push on the stomach when the woman gave birth? And I couldn't control myself from laughing because I said, no, the uterus also has a fundus. So they're not telling you to push on the stomach because then you're pushing the person to basically throw up. So it's pushing on the fundus of the uterus. Well, you know what? Honestly, I kind of hope that if you're an EMT, right, you should have an understanding of the reproductive system, right? If you're actually, no, this person was already an EMT. But the fact that he, even after his training and even after him being an EMT for 2 years, I think at that point, he still didn't understand that you shouldn't be pushing on the fundus of the stomach, you should be pushing on the fundus of the uterus, was hilarious to me. And it's scary. I just hope I never end up in his ambulance. So, no, I'm just kidding. But it is something that to note that a lot of the vocabulary like cortex and medulla, right? We have heard of these in multiple organs. So make sure you're referring to the right organ. So fundus of uterus. All right. So moving on, when you're looking at the female reproductive system, the uterus starts to come to the basically the external environment, and you have this narrowing at the end of the uterus called the cervix. So cervix is basically the structure that's going to protect the reproductive system or the upper reproductive system from the external environment. And it's kind of makes sense, right? Because again, if you want to, if you're having the baby inside the uterus and that development of the fetus inside that space, you really don't want the bacteria and harmful material from the external environment to have an easy access to the cervix. So sorry, to the uterus. So most of the time, if the woman is not ovulating, the actual cervix has a plug, a mucus plug. And this mucus plug basically ensures that nothing passes to the uterus and cause infection or problems for it. Now, this mucus plug is much thicker, I guess I should say, when a woman is actually pregnant. So when they get to their 9 months of pregnancy, if they're going to full term, a lot of time they start to see the mucus plug basically dissolving, which is a good sign that the body is getting ready to give birth, basically. But during the ovulation and only during ovulation and when the woman is ready to give birth, that mucus plug basically starts to dissolve to either give access to the sperm to go through the female reproductive system, or when right before pregnancy, when the mucus plug needs to be relaxed to allow the child to come through the birth canal. Not necessarily. So it actually differs from one person to another. So it says, is that when the water breaks? So if you're being induced in many cases, then you actually, by breaking the water, you also break through the mucus plug. But if you're giving natural birth, a lot of women actually start to lose chunks of that mucus plug even before their water breaks. But the chances of, if you are seeing a lot of mucus discharge right close to your pregnancy, the chances are that your water may break soon after. So hopefully that answers your question. Okay, the last thing that I want to talk about before we move on to this is when you look at the cervix, you have two narrowing on the cervix. So you have one closer to the uterus and one closer to the vagina. And the one closer to the uterus is called the internal os, and the one outside, closer to the outside, is referred to as the external os. So those narrowing, again, is another way of protecting, and the mucus plug is basically forming between these two. Okay, so the last part of the female reproductive system is basically another muscular tube referred to as, sorry, let me just read the question. Not necessarily, because the physical contact may break it, but it's the body itself that needs to do it. And a lot of times, because vagina stretches during sex, and I'm sorry if I'm disturbing some people, but because vagina is one of those muscles that can actually extend during intercourse, you may not actually reach the cervix. I mean, in many cases, the penis doesn't actually reach the cervix to cause the mucus plug to break. However, again, if you're pregnant and you're having sex, the chances are that it encourages the breakdown of the mucus plug and increasing the oxytocin level in the system that causes muscle contraction and increases your chance of giving birth. Hence, they always say, oh, if you really want to give birth and you're tired of being pregnant, have a lot of sex. That's the reason. Hopefully that answered your question. All right. Vagina, it is a muscular tissue. Again, it has the ability to extend in terms of size. It is also used during childbirth as well as intercourse, which is logical. Again, one path for it. It is sitting posterior to the urethra, but is anterior to the rectum. So if you look at the reproductive system, here is the female reproductive system. So here is your bladder in female. Here is the urethra for female. And then here is the uterus, cervix, and then vagina. And then in the back, you have basically the rectum. So if you're looking at the differences, the main difference between male and female reproductive system is the fact that female reproductive and urinary system have separate opening called urogenitalial opening, versus in male, the urethra uses for both release of the semen as well as for release of the or excretion of urine. Okay. In terms of the vagina, vagina also has 3 layers. Adventitia, which is again the connective tissue that forms the outer wall of the vagina. The fact that it is a muscular tissue, again, similar to uterus, it is made up of a smooth muscle. And the lining of the vagina, it's mucosa, which kind of makes sense because you want to basically lubricate the tissue during both intercourse and during childbirth. So it is the type of tissue that you can find in it is lamina propria, which is connective tissue, and a stratified squamous epithelium. And again, I hope by now, this is our last lecture, our last few slides of the lecture. When you hear stratified squamous epithelium, what word comes to your mind? What is its goal? Okay, there are flattened layers of cells, but what is its function? Protection, correct. So you always want to basically, again, vagina opens up to the external environment. It has to go through childbirth and intercourse, which means basically a lot of friction. So you want to have multiple layers of cells for the purpose of protection. And then lastly, you have, in many women, you have a very thin vascular connective tissue that covers the vagina called the hymen. And I want to make sure that it is clear, not every woman have hymens, and that causes a lot of problems if you're a woman that lives in Middle Eastern countries or Asian countries for most part. But not all women have it. That doesn't mean that they are, they haven't, I guess they have intercourse. And then a lot of women also lose it if they do extreme exercises. They even lose it before intercourse as well. Sorry, I don't understand what the question is. Yes, the vagina is acidic. But sorry, what is your question? Does semen gives it a pH? No. Oh, I see. Now I understand. So remember when we talked about bulbourethral and prostate gland? So both of these are basically contain basic solutions that help the sperm survive through the acidic environment of vagina. So in short, the semen that gets released into the female body during intercourse is not going to change the environment of the vagina. Rather, it's going to protect the sperm from the acidic environment. Hopefully that makes sense. Okay. So in case of female and the external genitalia, we have the two layers of, sorry, I'm going to move forward because it's easier to show it on this lateral view. So we have the two lips, the inner lips or labia minus or minor or minora is the more vascular layer that protects the erectile tissue you see in blue color right here called the clitoris. The outer lip, which is homologous to scrotum, is basically a skin that has the hair growing out of it, called the labia major or majus. We have the fatty tissue right in front of the female reproductive system called mons pubis, which usually actually become larger even during pregnancy. The other thing that you have is, let's see, hold on. I want to make sure I cover everything. Here is a different view of the female reproductive system. So up here, you have, again, the erectile tissue that's protected by the labia minor. Right underneath that, you have the opening for the urethra, so urethral orifice. The larger opening underneath that would be the opening for the vagina or the vestibule for vagina. And then you have the opening for the digestive system or anus. The triangular structure that you see is called, oh my God, my brain stopped working. Oh, literally stopped working. Perineum, there you go. So the triangle that you see here is a perineum triangle, basically shows all the orifices for the female reproductive system. Let's see. So again, quick note, guys, clitoris is going to be homologous to the glans penis in terms of erectile tissue. It does contain erectile tissue in very similar to, again, corpus cavernosa or corpus spongiosum. It is covered by the prepuce, which is basically the labia minor. The word homologous, which means they do the same job in both sexes. They might be different in terms of features, but they do the same job. Again, perineum is what, yeah, I should have just come to this slide, is that triangle that includes all of the orifices. And then the other one that I mentioned also was the labia major. Make a note for yourself, that's homologous to the scrotum for male. So don't forget Mammary tissue is another one we're going to talk about briefly. So that's the tissue you basically can see on women's breast. It is, interestingly, modified sweat glands, which I think is fascinating to actually think about. So the glandular structure is undeveloped when a woman is not pregnant. So it's mostly fatty tissue. However, when a woman is actually starts to see a significant increase in their estrogen and progesterone level, the early stages of pregnancy, throughout the pregnancy, it actually enhances the glandular structures to start to produce milk. And then at the time of birth, as I mentioned earlier, the hormone oxytocin is the one that's going to help you with the release of the milk, and the hormone prolactin is going to help with the production of the milk. But the development of the tissue is highly dependent on the estrogen and progesterone during early stages of pregnancy. Again, guys, these pictures are your friends. Make sure you guys feel very comfortable with the labeling. This is a very good overview picture that includes the reproductive organs. It includes the structures in them, the layers of the uterus, and then the ligaments that holds the reproductive system in place. So make sure you guys feel very comfortable with the labeling for your lecture exam when it comes to female reproductive system. And then this is also another one that you need to be comfortable with, going from the anterior view to the lateral view for the reproductive system. And that's it. We are done with our lecture. That was our last lecture for the semester.